when South Africans come through London, it is sort of often in dribs and drabs, and so we wanted to take some time out of Anthony's holiday, which he very gracefully agreed to talk about this sort of seminal year in South Africa, hosting the G20. Anthony is the head of the Secretariat for the B20, the business grouping of countries that works with the G20 leaders. Anthony has had a long career in various different places in the private sector, through Nedbank and various Nedbank entities, but then particularly in the Presidency, where he was deployed to be head of investment facilitation, the sort of circus master of the investment lions, as they were known, who got sent around the world to talk about investment and corral investment for South Africa through the first administration, first round of Poser administration, some 5 or so years ago, and more recently led the PMO for the National Logistics Crisis Council, and has had a number of important roles related to the UK-South Africa bilateral relationship, including the UK-South Africa Investment Forum as well. Anthony was originally, or maybe still is, a lawyer, and studies an LLB from WITS, but also has a PhD in economic history from the University of Cambridge, and so deep ties to the UK there. So I've asked Anthony to speak for about 10 minutes just to lay the groundwork about what is going on this year with this big sort of international role that South Africa has, that organised business has in terms of chairing the B20. Just to add a disclaimer, Anthony obviously can't speak on behalf of government as a private sector person, but obviously has deep insight into the sort of G20, the sort of official sector track as well. I'm sure we'll share some colour on that, but just a disclaimer, he obviously doesn't represent the government or G20 itself. So welcome, Anthony. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Sven, for those very kind introductions. Had I known you were going to say such nice things about me, I would have made a repeat visit, but maybe I'll get invited again. It's difficult to talk about the B20 or the Business 20 at this point in the cycle. When we started, it was very easy because nobody knew anything about it. Now we have at least some level of understanding, so please forgive me if I start at the beginning, because I don't think it's universal. And certainly when I was first involved, and Cas Kuvadia, who is our Sherpa, which is the title for the person who guides a G20 or related engagement group process, asked me to join him on this journey. I had to Google B20. It sounded like a scam. We have some of those in our part of the world. And it is the official engagement group of the G20. So the G20 in its current form, since it has its leaders or Sherpa track and has moved beyond just finance, has about a dozen or so engagement groups which have grown over the years. There's business, women, youth, labor, more recently oceans as well. The business is one of the most well-established and organized of the engagement groups, and it's run by Business Unity South Africa, which is the largest business organization in South Africa. It is set up as almost a separate entity, in the sense that although it is a South African B20, we don't see our role as representing South Africa. We are merely custodians on behalf of business across the B20 for this year. And that really is the role of the B20. It's to provide a voice for business across the G20 countries into the G20 process and more broadly. And by that, of course, we include the member countries of the European and African unions. So we inherited the B20 from CNI, the Brazilian National Employers Association, not really knowing anything about it. They've been enormously helpful. We've adopted their structures and created working processes and procedures to effectively develop these recommendations that will be made to the South African presidency, to the president, as president of the G20, ahead of the G20 summit in November in Johannesburg. Now, because I think there's different levels of understanding, it'll be helpful to get into the discussion and take questions. But before that, I can just give you an update of where we are and what we've learned. So we have constituted 8 task forces, each of which focuses on a broad economic area, the majority of which we inherited from Brazil and previous B20s. We added an additional one on what we call industrial transformation and innovation. It speaks in particular to supply chain diversification, manufacturing, job growth. So how do you create manufacturing industrialization in the 21st century, in particular in emerging markets in Africa? We, much like the South African government, see this not just as a South African B20, but as an African one. So we don't claim to speak on behalf of the continent. We don't think that would be possible, but we try and provide a platform for African issues to be raised and to have a voice. Each task force is chaired by a South African or African chief executive or chairperson, and we have some very distinguished participants: the chief executive of Standard Bank, the biggest bank in Africa, the chairman of Nedbank, coincidentally chair task forces, and working with their co-chairs who are drawn from business internationally. They then work with members who are up to 200 or so, representing businesses from around the world, to develop these papers. We've concluded our first drafts. We are now looking to finalize those at the end of June through July and hand them over to the Presidency, I would hope by August or so, August, September at the very latest. And then during this time, engage with various constituencies, stakeholders, to advocate for the recommendations of the B20. Now, you may be wondering, what are these recommendations? Because I've spoken only process and no substance. So I can't really front run where we are because they're still being developed. I think what has been interesting and what we have learned is there's been an enormous amount of interest in this B20 cycle in South Africa. So initially, when we found ourselves in a very turbulent world from a geopolitical perspective, there was anxiety. What does this mean? Is it going to be a disaster? And actually, it's been a sort of positive market dynamic, if you like, from a organizational perspective, because of the level of interest we have found. So we've been very well supported by South African and international businesses wanting to participate, because so much of the G to G process appears to be gridlocked, that they're looking for other constituencies and mechanisms, and business is still operating very well. So we have representation from businesses from across the G20, including from groups that may geopolitically have differences, and I think are working well towards coming up with recommendations that are meaningful and yet can attract some sort of or sufficient consensus when we actually issue that. It's important. Peter provided the disclaimer around the difference between the G20 and the B20. The G20, of course, is the main show. That really is why we're all here. The South African government holds the presidency. DIRCO and the presidency are responsible for what's called the Sherpa track, or in other words, the more non-economic working groups, and National Treasury and the South African Reserve Bank run the finance track. In total, there's about 23 or so working groups, and then some task forces, 3, which address cross-cutting themes. As the B20, we engage with those working groups, or we try to, and we'll do so more now that our recommendations are solidifying, so that there's at least visibility between what's happening in the B process and in the G process. We also, of course, do talk to the other engagement groups. They have a very different structure from the B20. We'll talk about that later. But effectively, our role is to try and influence positively and contribute to the process of the G20. Business does not make policy. Business is not responsible for the outcomes of the G20. And I think there's questions about, what can be achieved in this environment in terms of outcomes and recommendations. But for us, it will be important that our voice is at least heard, and we put the issues on the table in a way that reflects the interests of business at this moment, but also with an African perspective. I think hopefully, Peter, that gives a bit of a sense of where we come from, what we're doing, and where we are, and I can talk a little bit later about what happens next.
Great, thanks very much for that introduction. So we're going to have a little bit of a fireside chat, and then we'll open up to some Q&A afterwards. I suppose my opening cheeky sort of question is, what is the point? In the sense, is it a talking shop? That is always the accusation thrown at both G20 and also some of the other engagement groups. And I found, being sort of peripherally involved, there is this remarkable tension between these sort of high-level hand wavings, if you like, to some degree, versus some of the huge specificity, if you like, of some of the things that are being talked about in some of the working groups, whether it's about African debt or about ratings issues and these sorts of things. How do you balance that out to make an impact that's broad enough without watering down, without sort of least common denominatorism, if you want to put it through this process?
So I think the G20 and the engagement groups are by definition a talking shop. They have no authority to legislate or to implement. Even the G20 doesn't. So the G20 adopts recommendations, which are then passed over to the member country governments, as well as international bodies such as the Financial Stability Board, the IMF, etc., which then may, hopefully would, implement them. But it has no authority or rule-making ability. But they, for all that, I think it can be influential if we have a look at previous successes and impact around, in particular, where the G20 has made certain laws and changes following the global financial crisis, for example. And when it comes to the other engagement groups, including the B20, there's even less formal authority. And it's quite difficult to draw a causal connection between a B20 recommendation and what's adopted by the G20. Certainly we do track the degree of alignment and overlap, and previous hosts would like to say, yes, they said that because we put it in there. Would it have been in there anyway? We don't know, but we would not want to work in complete isolation. So we try very hard to make sure that the issues we are dealing with are those that are on the table and on the agenda for the G20. I think that in itself is important, and it gives strength to some of those parties around the table to make those arguments, because we make it not as a member country, but rather as business that cuts across different nationalities. The question of lowest common denominator-ish and how we reach a decent outcome, I mean, we're kind of still finding out. So as I've said in my previous discussion with the chamber, we haven't done this before. We don't actually know what we're doing. We're sort of learning as we go along, and already there are things I would do differently next time. Of course, there's no next time. That's the nature of these things. But we have found the discussions that have been held, the climate, to be respectful, to be very conducive. And I think the nature of the chairpersons who guide the process, as well as the executives who participate, we haven't been derailed. Again, there's a limit to what you can achieve. And later maybe I'll talk about the difference between the B7 and the B20, because I think that could be instructive. But we're optimistic we will come up with recommendations and a communique that reflects business consensus broadly, but at the same time is not, completely lowest common denominator. And maybe the final point to make is we don't require every country to agree. We don't have national business associations participating. Business is the primary driver. National business associations sit on our advisory or advocacy council. Some may disagree at the end. We're trying to avoid that, but ultimately we can still hopefully move forward impactfully, that notwithstanding.
And the process this year fits into obviously a continual cycle of international events, whether it's UNGA, whether it's IMF annual meetings. There's a broad swirl of sort of obviously charities, advocacy groups, NGOs, international business people doing things anyway in this global cycle. How do you sort of maintain a unique voice within that? And in particular, how much of a private sector, to be very blunt, capitalist, profit making, whatever you want to characterize business as, right, in a responsible manner, right, in a sort of responsible parts of business within the work streams. How do you maintain that flavour through all this sort of pressure that comes to bear?
It's quite a bottom-up process. So the task forces, their chairs, their co-chairs, who are drawn, largely, I would say 90% from corporations, South African, African, and multinational corporations, ensure that we have that perspective. We do have some DFIs and multilateral institutions as co-chairs, but that's quite the exception. And I think that is probably the biggest guarantor that it reflects business interest. But we've also tried to put some guardrails in place, that we do have principles around, sustainable growth, global cooperation. We believe that a world where there is shared economic growth and economic connections is a better one. The task force that comes out with a diametrically opposed recommendation, we would have to try and work with them to see where we go to. And again, we haven't reached that, but we still have a little way yet to walk.
I suppose related to that, we saw in the sort of opening conference summit of B20 in February, B20 itself said relatively little. That was maybe the peak time of trade uncertainty globally, of tariffs. But there were a lot of voices there who were maybe making rallying cries for free trade. How do you see your role in maybe being a rallying point for sort of free trade and the like in these geopolitical times versus maybe the members and the people involved being that voice? It's an interesting tension, particularly as we move towards November and sort of the culmination of this process for South Africa.
It is, and I think it's a good example of my hesitancy when I spoke about not wanting to front run. So the recommendations of the Trade and Investment Task Force will absolutely address tariffs, barriers to trade, various, in their various forms, and at that point we'll have a very clear statement. There have been calls for us to speak out, but again, as B20 South Africa, who are we? Most legally speaking, we're not the voice of South African business, and we can't claim to speak on behalf of business across the G20 at this point. Once the process has produced a result, we would feel more confident doing so, and I think this is where there's a distinction between the B7, and we would, maybe I think even the B7 and the G7 are diverging a bit now. But the Canadian Chamber of Commerce put out a very strong statement criticizing tariffs, and clearly Canada's at the front line of that a couple of months ago, but they didn't do it qua B7, they did it as the chair of the B7.
Right.
The B7 has subsequently hosted their summit, I think last month, and they've also put out quite a strong communique, maybe not as strong as the Canadian statement, but quite a strong communique based on the input of those 7 business associations. And I think there's a lot more alignment in the B7, there's a lot more homogeneity than there is in the B20. So, I don't think we're going to say the same thing, but we certainly take note of the B7 communique. We think it's very important, and it's a point to incorporate and consider in our work. And we in turn hope that the B20 communique is considered by the B7 when it's hosted by France next year.
So we might get a vibe coming out of it as opposed necessarily to a singular statement on these sorts of.
You'll have to wait and see.
Yes. The other tension is around this issue of an African G20, B20. When I travel to other countries on the continent, there is often a lot of pushback, on the notion of South Africa as a leader, a criticism maybe if it's a bit presumptive, that kind of thing. How do you manage that tension, and also how do you manage maybe the fact that UK businesses and other people have their own problems that need addressing as well? I mean, a lot of the working groups have been quite African problem focused as opposed maybe to more generic global problems.
There's a tension between South Africa and other countries on the continent that predates this. I think the South African government has worked hard to be inclusive. The fact that the African Union is now a member of the G20 has really helped. And the South African government has worked to build capacity there. I think it's their second full G20 cycle. President Ramaphosa was in Abidjan at the Africa CEO Summit a few weeks ago, and we supported him there together with in Brand South Africa and Rand Merchant Bank, one of our sponsors. And I think it was important that he was there. It was seen as a African gathering and, Francophone one in West Africa that certainly he'd never attended, and South African business doesn't necessarily participate in to the same extent. And, my personal experience there was that there was great interest in participating and understanding what it was and potentially attending the summit in November. So I think there's a sense of pride that it's taking place in Africa, rather than sort of resentment that South Africa is purporting to speak on behalf of others. So it's more about how it's managed.
Maybe talk a little bit about the passover process from B20 to G20 and your recommendations. And are you responsible for still trying to enact the Brazilian ones? Is there any sort of handover there? I know they were doing a lot of accountability and corruption, for instance, that was interesting for the first time. And given the maybe greater tensions at G20 level, there have been communiques, for instance, so far from their finance track. They might not be from the leaders' tracks either. What can we really hope out of this passover process of the B20 recommendations?
So, if I come back to your first very unkind question about what's the point of it all. The other criticism is once you're done, you're done. So you hand over your recommendations and the next host has freedom to do what they want. There's no secretariat, there's no implementing agency. We certainly look at the recommendations of Brazil. We are going to publish a report on the recommendations and the extent to which they've been adopted by the G20. And so they've influenced our work. In many ways, they were, if not a starting point, a strong influence. And B20s do try and create legacy initiatives that are responsible for either trying to take forward particular recommendations, but tend to do so in a country. It's very presumptuous for a host to say this will carry forward, ad infinitum. It really, once you've had your shot, you wish to be influential, and then it's sort of out there in the world. I do think though that there's greater momentum. We do have an informal troika with South Africa, Brazil, and the United States. We'll talk a little bit about the US process. I'm sure that may be an area of interest, and are working to, even if we can't guarantee continuity, that there's visibility in a process where at least I think the outcome of the different B20s are properly considered.
So just to get into some of the weeds on some of the task teams, so maybe run through them briefly. There's quite a few of them. Maybe we can just think about some of the key outcomes. That's maybe that's South Africa, that BUSA as the host position South Africa is maybe hoping to get from them. And maybe you can just touch on some of them around maybe where there's some continuity from Brazil. One of the most South African-ish sounding ones is the energy mix and just transition one. Of course, where South Africa has obviously been a leader since Glasgow COP here, in not necessarily successfully, but certainly in terms of visibility around the just transition. Maybe you could speak a little bit about that one to start with.
So, yeah, absolutely. I think South Africa has been at the forefront of the just transition concept. And you may have noticed we changed the title of that task force from Brazil. We called it Energy Mix because the concept of a transition already makes certain presumptions, but we also put in just transition as opposed to just transition. So to bring that South African experience perspective into the debate and the discussion, it's not going to be a South African outcome. It's not going to be focused on green hydrogen necessarily, which is occupies a lot of space in South Africa at the moment. But given the level of South African participation, we think it will be informed for the better by that particular experience. You mentioned earlier, what does it mean for UK business? So we try not to deal with national level issues. So there's nothing on South Africa specific issues such as, say, the Expropriation Act, which is something South African business had raised some time ago. So from a BUSA or National Business Association perspective, we've had to be very clear that that's of no interest to the rest of the G20. We can absolutely talk about property rights and we can talk about transformation, but you have to do that at a level of principles rather than details. Again, what the recommendations are of the particular, energy task force are. We'll have to wait and see.
And digital transformation, that's a particularly interesting one with that from perspective, obviously, where maybe arguably Global South has more to say about these things in terms of obviously economic empowerment, those sorts of things. How is that one going?
So I think connectivity and what it means for Africa and Africans is very prominent there, because this is the continent where there's the least connectivity and the most exclusion from the digital economy, with very obvious consequences. I think there's a recognition of that. So other developed G20 participants are not saying this means nothing to us, because the underpin, of course, is that Africa's growth and economic development is an economic opportunity for the world. It's not an African problem or opportunity, it really is a global one. And I think there's a recognition that you can take Africa-specific issues, seemingly Africa-specific issues, and find a way to show that they have broader relevance and application, and the digital is certainly one. It's less around sort of details on big digital taxes and specifics around that, and much more around questions of access and participation.
There's obviously a lot of champions on the continent from the digital space. You've seen them turn up maybe more than in some of the other work streams.
I think so. We have struggled to get business participation from the continent beyond South Africa. So I think we absolutely do. But there's no single organized African business body. It's often kind of the same names who are cited as the African champions. And we've tried to move beyond that. We've certainly done more than previous B20s. I don't think we've done as well as we would have wanted, but we're still working, particularly ahead of the summit, to increase participation by business from across the continent.
And it's obviously a continent where it's hard in many senses to do business despite the amazing opportunities. And I think integrity and compliance rights is a work stream that Brazil introduced, and you've continued. What sort of African flavors, also African flavor, given obviously the experience of state capture, is maybe being brought to bear there?
So it's a work stream or task force that was introduced some time ago, I think in the early 2010s. It was skipped over by India for reasons, and Brazil reintroduced it, and South Africa has kept it because we think it's critical. Given South Africa's history of, as you say, state capture, corruption, and also challenges with corporate governance. We've had corporate scandals in recent years that have proven very costly for investors, for business, and have damaged the credibility of business. So it's focused not just on public sector, but also private sector. It's also looking at questions of reporting and standards. So the question of common standards, including of what's sometimes called ESG reporting. How do you create common standards? What do they mean? What are the risks of excluding certain countries or beneficiaries? It is also a task force that has historically worked very closely with the G20 anti-corruption working group, and we think that's important as well. So there's a much stronger degree of continuity in that task force than others, because there are global bodies who participate from year to year, and whilst certainly not a secretariat, are able to provide a perspective that doesn't just end in a given year.
The finance and infrastructure track then has maybe the strongest parallel into the G20 process with the finance track there. I mean, there was a big meeting yesterday of the G20 Sustainability Task Force in Cape Town. My team was at. That is maybe peripherally involved with some of the B20 stuff on it. It's where there is a lot of detail and a lot of interesting potential conflicts versus maybe what Africa wants for investment, Africa's view of risk, right, versus maybe a sort of developed market investor view of risk that's starting to come to the fore. How do you see that playing out, particularly this sort of maybe tension between different perspectives?
So the chair of that task force, Sim Chabalala, was at the working group meeting, at least the side event, this week, and he's made sure that in the composition of his co-chairs, he has representation from key regions, including, as you say, those developed markets, from large financial institutions in the US, the UK, and Europe, so their voice is heard, in addition to the African perspective that Standard Bank and others, of course, bring. It's a good example of an issue that would not have been on the table previously. So the question around the cost of capital in Africa is something that South Africa's G20 presidency has raised. It's been raised in our task force.
Just chaired by Trevor Manuel in the G20.
Indeed. And we think it's one that, while clearly of applicability to Africa, is broader in the sense of unlocking economic opportunities, unlocking growth, and the story of Africa's opportunity is a global opportunity. So we haven't seen pushback and resistance. I suppose the last point to make on that is it's not as if every recommendation and the task force is exclusively focused just on African issues. It will also deal with broader recommendations relating to finance.
But it's an interesting one, I think, given those same topics of cost of capital affect India, affect Brazil, didn't come up to quite the same degree. The global debate has certainly moved further on this topic around cost of capital, around ratings and things, but it's an interesting one maybe for the broader global south, right? Not just Africa.
It is. I think it's been raised particularly in the African context, and if you speak to the ratings agencies, they will argue why there isn't that differential. And it's important, we do engage with the rating agencies as part of the process. Clearly, everyone speaks to their book, but I think a data-driven discussion is helpful. But it's really the fact that South African government has raised it and made it a theme of the G20 that has elevated the African focus of it.
I think it's also interesting, right, because it's maybe more than the other task teams where there is an ask for a change of mindset, right? You're saying to the world, you've got us wrong in terms of your sense of risk perception. I find that very interesting.
The question of what are we asking? Maybe that was your original question. And I think it's the sort of thing where we're not just talking to governments, we're also talking to the private sector. So even if the G20 fails to adopt certain recommendations or fails to take forward certain recommendations, we're also speaking to business. And business can act independently. They can be persuaded by the arguments that are made. In previous years, there have been recommendations in particular about diversity and female participation in the workforce that some private sector G20 participants have taken forward and are measuring themselves against, regardless of the fact that it's not a G20 policy priority. And I think this is an example of where there will be an authoritative recommendation and hopefully cause some sort of a rethink.
Yeah, no, I think it's super interesting. London is obviously one of the key places where people make these risk decisions, particularly around Africa, in terms of global investors, global asset managers. Could you maybe just talk about why the Trade and Investment Task Force is a different one, how it's different maybe from the finance and infrastructure one, maybe some of the different sort of outcomes you're looking for there?
There's a degree of arbitrariness to some of these task force constructs. So trade and investment, finance and infrastructure, to explain the difference between investment and infrastructure be very difficult to do. And it's historic. So we've inherited it and we've kept it for continuity. We have people who participated in previous cycles. So for example, our chair, the chairperson of the IDC, Musima Buza, is the chair of the Trade and Investment Task Force. She was a co-chair previously in Brazil. The IDC, of course, is South African Industrial Development Corporation, a state DFI. And I would say the focus there is more on trade than on investment, because trade is, it's more exclusively within this task force, and because it's so topical at the moment. Another area of overlap would be, say, on climate finance or green finance. It could be in finance, it could be in investment, it could be in energy, any one of those. And so what we've done as a secretariat is try and make sure that it's clear who takes the lead on the topic and that there's not overlap or indeed contradiction in the output.
Okay. And then just to wrap up some of the other ones, we have obviously employment and education, food systems and agriculture, and industrial transformation.
So employment and education is also an unusual one because it's not really private sector. It's so much of it is public sector, but it's also essential to the private sector. And there's quite a high degree of participation there by business bodies, including the Institute of Employers and internationally and others. And I think one of the big challenges that has come up, or big burning issues, is AI. The threat and the opportunity around AI, and that's a difference this year compared to previous. It certainly would have been raised previously, but not to the extent now. And I think that's an important one, and it also speaks to digital. So there's an overlap that we see emerging there. Brazil introduced sustainable food and agriculture. We thought it was important to keep it because agriculture is critical to Africa and South Africa. It's also one of the themes of South Africa's G20 presidency. And the question there is, there's a climate component to it, there are adverse conditions, also around access to innovation, to chemicals, to fertilizers, to seeds. We have multinational firms participating. So there are tensions in the process. And I think what's important for us is to find a way through that. And that builds on what Brazil did. And that certainly is one where I think there will be a degree of continuity because there's only one previous cycle, whereas industrial transformation innovation is brand new. So it's chaired by Andrew Kirby. He's the chief executive of Toyota South Africa. We thought it was really important to have a multinational manufacturer who's got experience of global supply chains. And in the light of COVID disruptions, trade wars, issues around supply chain diversification and security are still very topical. Tariffs have made that even more so, but also the demand for local beneficiation. We've seen countries adopting very strong measures around beneficiating their resources. What does that mean? What is the optimal outcome? Again, it's a bit of a blank slate, so it's been a challenging task force, but we think that there will be meaningful recommendations emerging.
So in terms of some of that US turbulence globally, we should still be watching the industrial transformation one and the trade one maybe for where there'll be some interesting things.
Could be anywhere, that's a moving target. We've had a lot of questions about the United States, and fortunately we have a very good relationship with the United States Chamber of Commerce. They are the main business body in the US. They were engaged in Brazil. We met them there. They are part of a troika. Their Africa VP attended our launch in Cape Town. She was in Johannesburg recently, and they are very committed to assuming the chair of the B20 in December when the US assumes the presidency, the chair of the B20 when the US assumes the G20 presidency. US business is very engaged and committed. So we have US firms as sponsors, as co-chairs, as active participants in B20 South Africa, none of whom have shown any intention to withdraw because of the noise that there is on the political side. And the view we've been given by American business and those participating is that there've been no directives from the administration that they should not engage in the B20 or with South Africa. And we think it's important. It's seen as that there's a distinction between the B2B and the G2G. And I suppose this is as much a B2G as it's a B2B process, but it's one where we think this is a vital channel, and maybe it's one of the reasons why there's been interest in B20 South Africa, because the US is the next host. I think had it been another country, then again, it'd be less interest, but we're very fortunate to be working with the US Chamber. And
we've started to see the US administration maybe in the last week or so talk a little bit more about their Africa strategy, very commercially centric. They've been at energy conferences in Cape Town in a very large way recently. It's certainly not this sort of draw up, the drawbridge entirely. I suppose the two quick fire questions: is the US going to host G20 next year? Is the simplistic question, and is Trump going to come to South Africa?
So I could just say that I can't talk about the US administration at G20, but I'll give you my personal views. So I think the South African government has done a good job of engaging with the administration, and they're focused on G20 participation as important. I think US business sees it as important, not to create a sense of isolation and to withdraw. And so we're confident that the US is still engaging in the G20 process. I don't know. That's certainly our understanding. will the President of the United States be at the G20 summit? There's only one person who knows that. I think South Africa is working very hard to create conditions where, you know, he would want to be there. But it's a lot of time.
Golf.
You said that, not me.
And just then touching on legacy finally, what are the emerging plans? How they involve the local economy, local employment? What does legacy mean? Often when we think in London of, you know, Olympic legacy and things, these things often are not always things that work out great.
So we're working very closely with BUSA because, of course, BUSA is the entity that persists. B20 South Africa, we're shutting up shop by the end of the year, and we're all gone. To create and drive a legacy initiative, we're working with the members of BUSA and Business Leadership South Africa, which is supporting BUSA, to develop proposals around appropriate legacy initiatives. So there are proposals which are looking at issues that will create space for investment to grow economic, sort of more inclusive economic growth in South Africa and job creation, which also have applicability in the continent more broadly, and in particular to countries where there are, you know, resource-rich countries that are facing challenges, sort of developing economically. So we're running quite a structured process, but ultimately it's something that BUSA will have to adopt and be responsible for implementing going forward. We're also working to create visibility amongst other B20 member countries. It's not just a South African thing that we're doing secretly. We think it's important for them to give input, as well as whether they think there are any broader initiatives that South Africa should champion. We're not presuming to do so, but certainly we're continuing those that have come from previous B20s. And if there is a request for a global initiative coming out of B20 South Africa, that's certainly something we're considering.
What did Brazil and India do before?
So India have created a B20 Global Institute. It's quite India-based, but it certainly does a lot of very useful research on B20. It has a secretariat. They provided input to us and to Brazil. And Brazil have created a particular Brazilian-focused development initiative that we're not that familiar with, but maybe in previous years. Bloomberg New Energy Finance hosts a carbon data and research center. And there are an initiative coming out of Brazil on women in trade, and in particular, how do you measure and increase participation of women in business and trade globally as well. So there are initiatives that's around finding an owner. And I think what Brazil and others have done quite well is to find existing international organizations that can carry forward these particular initiatives.
Great. Cool. Thanks for a wide-ranging fireside chat. Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.